began his State Department career under John Schlosser. And when I was communicating with Anish, he said that he owed so much to John for just being such an outstanding mentor. So with that, I'll turn it over to the outstanding mentor. You're on mute, John. John, you're mute.
Hi. I want to extend a warm welcome to my former colleague and friend, Anish Goel, who's been gracious enough to agree to do this presentation tonight. I met Anish in 2003 when he came to my office as a science fellow. And within, a year and a half or so, we worked on converting him to the civil service. He became a full-time employee of the US government. And Anish started off with a portfolio that was largely confined to science and technology, but made such a positive impression that we quickly turned him loose on the sensitive and very important nuclear portfolio. And he became deeply involved in the negotiations that eventually were headed by Nick Burns, who was our Undersecretary of State in those days and was our speaker, as many of you know, our featured speaker in 2019 here in San Diego. And then Anish, having come to the attention of important people doing that work, was asked to join the National Security Council staff and went over and was a senior advisor for South Asia in the closing year or so of the George W. Bush administration. Did such good work that he was asked to stay on, one of the few professional staffers that was asked to stay on between Bush and Obama. And he was the senior director, and I think you were also a special assistant to the president there, right, Anish, for South Asia with President Obama. He did all the prep work for a visit of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh to Washington, and then the historic visit of President Obama to India in 2010. And really did some amazing work, and the breakthrough in relations with India that had begun during the Bush administration was followed up on in spades in the Obama administration. After a couple of years, he moved on to the private sector, was with Boeing in Seattle for several years. And then he just couldn't stay away from policy, so he returned to Washington as a senior fellow, the International Security Program of the New America think tank, beginning in December 2013. After a number of years, he was asked to join the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee, working directly with the late Senator McCain, doing some very important work on defense policy with respect to East Asia and South Asia. And following that, became Vice President of the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies in October 2019. And beginning last year, rejoined the government with the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, sort of an in-house think tank at the Pentagon. And he's been there 11 months. So with that as an introduction, hope not too long, I'll be happy to turn it over to Anish to talk. Oh, by the way, his subject, as most of you know, is going to be India's relations with its neighbors in South Asia and a little further afield. So over to you, Anish.
All right. Thank you so much, John. And I do want to reiterate what Christine said about about the mentorship that I got from John when I started at the State Department. One thing John didn't mention is that I studied engineering in school. So when I showed up at the State Department, I knew nothing about South Asia. I knew nothing about foreign affairs. I knew nothing about government. And I worked for John for 4 years, and he taught me basically everything I know. So I really do have a lot to, I have to thank John almost for my entire career in government. So, and I'm glad that we've been able to keep in touch even after John retired and moved to San Diego. And so I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for your time. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see if I can make it work. Okay, can everybody see this? Yeah. Okay. All right. So as John mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about India and South Asia, and I put the subtitle here, Fraught Regional Relationships. And I think, most of you already know that India does not have good relationships in its region, so it is very fraught. And before I dive into it, I want to show you just one picture from my background. There we go. And so this is a picture of me and my boss at the time, a guy named Don Camp, who John also knows very well because he used to be our mutual boss at the State Department. This is the two of us briefing President Obama before his call to Prime Minister Singh in May of 2009, when Singh had just won re-election. And I chose this picture for two reasons. One is that it reminds me of a picture I used to see in John's office all the time. And it was John meeting the Vice President Quayle. And when I saw that picture, I used to think, God, I want to be that important. I want to meet like the president or the vice president. And it was a picture very similar to this. And so whenever I see this picture, it reminds me of sort of one of the inspirations that John gave me when I was an officer working for him. And the second reason I chose this picture is because the story here is that when Don and I walked into the Oval Office for this briefing, the president was in a terrible, grumpy mood. And you can see it on his face in this picture, right here. He does not look happy. And Don and I had no idea why he was so unhappy. All we knew is that he did not talk to us. He did not acknowledge our presence. He did not ask us any questions about this memo that we had written him. He was just like, we walked in and the tension was like as thick as butter. And from this vantage point, Don and I could see out the back of the windows in the back of the Oval Office, and we could see Marine One on the south lawn of the White House, waiting to take President Obama somewhere. And as soon as this call was finished that we had briefed him for, he didn't say a word to us, walked out, got on Marine One and left. And so we had obviously kept him from something. And it turns out, we found out later that he was on his way to Camp David to be with his family, and his family had gone the night before. And so the only reason he was still in Washington was for this call. And so he's really upset with us. And you can see it on my face. I am terrified here. And you can see I'm about to drop my little sheaf of papers here. And so I will just say, like, being in the room with a president who's grumpy is terrifying. I would not recommend it for anybody. So just a little story, and what this illustrates, is that presidents are people too, right? They miss their families, they get grumpy, they get short with their staff, happens to everyone. When the cameras are not around, they're not all politician all the time. So, okay, so let's move on. And, I like to start with this map of sort of all of Asia, right? Because it demonstrates for me, and I think to everyone, what a difficult region this is that India sits in, right? And I'm talking about this whole region here. And you can see that India is at the crossroads of everything, right? These waterways that, through which like 75% of the world's goods pass, it was on the Silk Road that used to pass through up here. It's basically on the way to the Suez Canal. China wants access to the Indian Ocean. Russia wants access over here. It has been trampled on for centuries. And so it is a difficult, difficult region. And this is a kind of history that the Indians keep in mind all the time, is that they have to protect their borders and they have to protect their sovereignty. And so if we drill down a little bit closer, we start looking at India's neighborhood, we can see that this is a dangerous neighborhood. Oops. This is a dangerous neighborhood because, you know, if you're India here, right, you got danger all around. You got Afghanistan and Pakistan here. You've got China here. You know, you've got instability in Burma here. Just over here, you've got Iran. Like, this is not a neighborhood that's conducive to, you know, feeling secure. And so this is the other thing that India keeps in mind, is that it's got danger on all its borders, basically. And this also drives a lot of the thinking for the Indians, and it drives a lot of their relationships that occur in the region. And so this is some of the stuff we're going to get into tonight. And so I chose just a few topics. You know, obviously you could talk about India and South Asia for like 4 hours. When Christine first asked me how long I plan to talk, I said, I can talk for 4 hours if you want. You know, we're going to just talk about a few countries. And on this table of contents, just to give you a roadmap where we're going, you know, we're going to spend about probably half to 2/3 of our time on India and Pakistan, because this is the most important relationship, you know, when you talk about just South Asia. And there's a lot of things to unpack here. So, you know, we're going to spend some time looking at India and Pakistan. Why do they hate each other? You know, are we going to see a nuclear war? What are some big questions? And then we're going to spend, you know, the last 1/3 or maybe half of the time on who else matters in the region. And these are the countries, you know, I chose to talk about. You could talk about a bunch of other countries in the region, but, you know, China, Afghanistan, Iran sort of loom largest in this region. And then, you know, you have Myanmar, some of the other smaller countries, and then you have this regional grouping down here. And so, you know, we'll touch on all of these things. And so my goal here is to sort of give you guys, you know, sort of just a primer on, you know, how India approaches its relationships in the region, what drives its thinking, you know, and how it sort of tries to balance all of its different interests. You know, I hope that this is informative. And at the end of the presentation, you know, we're obviously going to do Q&A, and I hope, you know, if you guys have different thoughts, I hope you'll tell me, because I'm always looking to sort of refine my thinking, or maybe, you know, incorporate something that I may not have thought about before. And so I really do want to hear from you guys what you think about what I have to say. So I'm really looking forward to the interactive part of this session at the end of the presentation. So let's get into it. India, Pakistan. And the first, you know, question that everyone always has, and so I put it first here, is why, oh why, right? Why do these two countries hate each other so much? And it goes back to 1947, when partition happened and both countries got independence. And the original roots back in 1947 were about Kashmir, because both countries wanted Kashmir to be part of their country. And there was a lot of, you know, animosity that got built up at that time because of the struggle over Kashmir. But since 1947, the relationship has really evolved over time, and there are a number of friction points now. You know, you have different land masses within Kashmir, you have borders in the Arabian Sea, you have water rights, you know, you have all sorts of other issues. But Kashmir is still a rallying cry about all things India, Pakistan. And the reason I make sure to put here is 1947 is that you can see that this is older than Israel, Palestine. And Israel, Palestine obviously is in the news a lot right now, right? Because they're perpetually at war, and a war just broke out in the last couple of days. But India, Pakistan is older. And I would argue it's much more complex of a crisis, because, you know, Israel, Palestine is a lot about land differences as well as religious differences. And India and Pakistan has that too. But then you layer on top of it nuclear war, you layer on top of it all these other issues, and it really, I think, becomes a much more complex problem. Fundamentally, as you know, this bullet says here, Pakistan fears domination and dismemberment by India. This is something that has driven their national security for a long, long time. And if you talk to Pakistani officials, that's what they'll say. India does things to heighten these insecurities. India does not want to allay these insecurities. They heighten them. And, you know, I put here on the slide wittingly or unwittingly, but I think it's mostly wittingly. They do things purposely to drive Pakistan bonkers. You know, and I put a few examples here, right? Water supply, hegemony, revocation of Kashmir's autonomous status. We'll talk about some of these things. And then Pakistan purposely engages in cross-border terrorism. And so there's all this, you know, complexities that goes into this relationship. So if we look at those, if we pull back from that a little bit though, and look at sort of for Pakistan, what's the issue? And I'm just going to read this to you. I know you all can read, but the belief that for Pakistan, the belief that India poses an existential threat drives its national security and foreign policy, as well as relations with all its neighbors and with the United States. And this belief borders on paranoia, not entirely rooted in reality. And I say not entirely rooted, and I'll get to the reason why I put not entirely in a couple of slides. But this really is a paranoia. Pakistan truly believes that India is out to dismember it and to sort of destroy its territorial integrity. Now, India doesn't think this way. For India, the belief that Pakistan poses an existential threat is no longer really a concern. It hasn't been for a number of decades now, but threats of terrorist attacks still factor into its national security decision-making. Pakistan is considered a problem to be managed. It's a problem to be managed. India would just as soon, prefer that Pakistan just go away. And so for India, it's not as much of an all-inclusive driving force of its national security interests, but the terrorist attacks coming across the border still are very, very concerning. So think about this as the framework, when you're thinking about India, Pakistan. And let's look at how how these two countries compare. And these are just some statistics to level set us, in terms of how, these two countries. And you can see in every area, India is much, much bigger than Pakistan. Area is 4 times as large. Population is 5 times as large. And this, the statistic right here I like to show is that Muslims in India are almost equal to the number of Muslims in Pakistan. In fact, it probably is even more equal now because this is from 2019. But India is just as big a Muslim population as Pakistan. And so, this really drives sort of identity crises in Pakistan because Pakistan likes to think that it speaks for all Muslims in South Asia. But the question is, if India has just as many, who really is the biggest, Muslim country in South Asia? GDP, you can see order of magnitude difference. And even per capita, India is 50% bigger, 50% richer. And the military is much, much larger for India, 2.5 times as many active duty soldiers. They spend 4 times as much on their military. The imbalance is just mind-boggling here between two countries that used to be, pretty much on equal footing 70 years ago. So let's unpack this military issue a little bit longer, because this is what really drives the security relationship between India and Pakistan. And so if we look at India and Pakistan in the military, right? Military budget, like we just talked about, 5 times as big, 6 times as big. Military expenditure as a percentage of government spending, Pakistan is a little bigger, but this is because their GDP is so much smaller. So you can see that Pakistan has devoted a lot more of their economy to the military than India, almost 2 to 1. And that gives you a sort of a window into their mindset, about what their priorities are. You look at arms sales, not even close, right? Order of magnitude difference. We talked about active troops. So if I'm looking at all of this conventional imbalance, and let's think about the Pakistani mindset. If I'm Pakistan and I believe with all my heart that India is out to dismember me, and then I look at this conventional military imbalance, what am I thinking to myself? Oh crap, right? I gotta do something about this, right? And so they want to equalize this imbalance. And how do they equalize it? That's where we get to at the bottom here, nuclear warheads. You can see this is the one area where Pakistan has more nuclear warheads than India, or the one area where Pakistan has more than India. It's in nuclear warheads. And actually, I think this difference is even more pronounced in this. This is, publicly available information. But I think the differential is even bigger than what's shown here on this chart. And so this is where Pakistan tries to equalize its power with India. They feel like if they have a big stock of nuclear weapons, it plays a very deterrent effect on India. And layer on top of this that Pakistan does not have a no first use policy. India does, say we will not be the first one to use nuclear weapons. Pakistan does not have that same policy. Their policy is we will not use it unreasonably, but nowhere is that defined what is unreasonable. And so there's always, this worry that if they get into a big conventional war, then a nuclear war will break out and that it will escalate to nuclear pretty quickly. So this is one way that Pakistan equalizes this conventional imbalance. But there are other ways that it does it too. And this is, something that I think that's worth looking at a little bit closer is how do they equalize the imbalance? So up here we have nuclear weapons, which we just talked about. They also, use asymmetrical warfare. They have supported cross-border militant attacks against India for 3 decades now, probably longer. And they use it to both keep India off balance and to sow sectarian tensions. And it allows Pakistan to keep their hands clean, relatively clean, because they can say, well, we don't know who those people are. They're freedom fighters. They're just going across the border, to attack India. We don't have anything to do with it, right? And this is the line that they give again and again. And of course, everyone knows, John knows, I know, anyone who studies this region knows that this is not the case, right? Pakistan is involved with these groups. And so they use these cross-border militant attacks to, again, equalize the imbalance. And they borrow power from other countries. China, I think, is pretty obvious. It's an all-weather ally, all-weather friend, the largest arms supplier. Saudi Arabia and the UAE provide lots of money to Pakistan, both officially and through remittances. And they have strong support from the Islamic world, the organization of the Islamic Conference. Pakistan is the only Muslim country in the world with nuclear weapons. And so people, the Islamic world thinks of it as the Islamic nuclear weapon. And so there's always a strong support network there. And then I put the United States on this list. Everyone is always shocked when I put the United States on this list as a way that Pakistan equalizes this imbalance. But the truth is that the United States really is an equalizer, because whenever something happens in South Asia, and let's use the 2008 Mumbai attacks as an example, major terrorist attack happening in India that originated in Pakistan and is wholly responsible, was planned and carried out by Pakistani-based terrorists, what does the United States do? It immediately gets on the phone with the Prime Minister of India and says, don't respond. Don't attack Pakistan. We know that Pakistan did this, or terrorists based in Pakistan did this, but don't get into a regional war. That'll be horrible, right? We send, emissaries out to New Delhi. We say to meet with the Prime Minister, meet with the Foreign Minister. Don't do this, right? Don't respond kinetically. You've got to show restraint. And so Pakistan knows this, right? They know that the United States is going to restrain India. And so they use this to this advantage. I'm not saying this is the wrong thing for the United States to do, because again, preventing nuclear war, I think, is the most important US national security interest in this region. But Pakistan knows that we do this. And so they use the United States to equalize the imbalance. So what does this all mean going forward, right? We've talked about this imbalance. And usually when people talk about this region and talk about India and Pakistan, the first thing that comes to mind is, oh my gosh, nuclear weapons, right? You've got 2 countries that hate each other that both have nuclear weapons. So let's talk about nuclear war a little bit. And the threat of nuclear war in this region. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each of these questions, because each of these questions could take up, an hour in of itself. But I'll just give you my opinions, and we can talk about it more during the Q&A if anyone's interested. But the threat, increased or decreased in recent years? I would argue that it has decreased in recent years. And one of the reasons is because India is becoming more and more of an important global power, and it wants to be seen as a reasonable power and not one that can't manage its own affairs in its neighborhood. And so India's, incentive to get into a nuclear war, not that anyone ever has an incentive, but I'd say the disincentive to avoiding a nuclear war is growing. And beyond that, I don't think Pakistan wants to be seen as a country that is so irresponsible that it uses nuclear weapons. And so I actually think the threat has decreased in recent years. Skirmishes happen all the time. You know, there was a big, you know, worry in 2019 when they had that dogfight in the air over Kashmir that was going to escalate into a nuclear war. But I honestly think that the threat has decreased. In terms of how important nuclear arsenals are, to Pakistan, as I mentioned, it is very, very important. This is how they view, you know, this is how they equalize the imbalance. It's no less important for the Indians. You know, the United States has spent 45 years trying to get the Indians to give up its nuclear weapons, and there is no headway was made on that. This is a subject John knows very well from his time in the South Asia Bureau, and no headway was made. It's very important. They also view it as a deterrent effect against Pakistan, because if Pakistan has nuclear weapons, they need them to. And is the US role valuable or welcome? And it depends on who you talk to. Pakistan very much wants the US to be involved. They want the US to mediate. They want anyone to mediate. They've asked the UN, they've asked European countries, they've asked the US to come and mediate this issue. India does not want it at all. You even bring the subject up with the Indians and they will turn the other way and they will ignore you. And they will say, look, never bring this up again, otherwise our bilateral relationship is kaput. And they've been that blunt with US officials in the past. And so the US role is not welcomed by India. And I would say the US role in the bilateral relationship between India and Pakistan is not that valuable. I honestly don't think the US is the right mediator. And we're seeing other countries now maybe take up the mantle of third-party mediation. You know, a couple of months ago, there was news reports about the UAE hosting bilateral talks between India and Pakistan. So maybe they'd be a good mediator. I think a Gulf country would be great because they have good relationships with both countries. I think, you know, Norway would be a great, is it Norway? Yeah, Norway would be a great mediator because they have experience mediating in South Asia. They mediated in Sri Lanka for like 20 years before the Civil War ended. So I think third-party mediation has a role. I don't think the US has a role, though. US policy towards India's and Pakistan's nuclear programs. I think this is probably a question that most people are already very familiar with, is that US is very accepting of India's nuclear program, but absolutely unaccepting of Pakistan's program. And this has to do with the fact that India has never been accused of sort of major outward proliferation of its nuclear materials, whereas Pakistan has proliferated to almost all countries of concern around the world, including Iran, North Korea, Libya. When Libya gave up its nuclear weapons and US nuclear inspectors went in to get them, they basically all had made in Pakistan stamped on the side. And so this creates a very different attitude in the US system towards the acceptance of a nuclear program. And honestly, US's acceptance of India's nuclear program is what allowed the nuclear deal to happen, because there was a realization that India was never going to change, but we needed to have India on our side when it came to nuclear issues. And of course, at the time, Pakistan was like, we want the same deal. We want the same thing you guys are giving India. And there was laughing at Foggy Bottom. It could be heard for miles and miles because everyone knew that there was no way that was ever going to happen. Nuclear security, are terrorists on the brink of getting Pakistan's weapons? And the answer here, I'm happy to say, is no. Nuclear security is one thing that the Pakistanis take very, very seriously, actually. And as far as I know, I'll say this, as far as I'm aware, there's almost a minuscule chance of terrorists actually obtaining Pakistan's weapons. When terrorism looms large in Pakistan, that's the question everyone always asks. Oh my gosh, the terrorists are 30 minutes from Islamabad. What are we going to do about their nuclear weapons? Nuclear security is something they take very seriously. And so I don't think that the terrorists on the brink are obtaining Pakistan's weapons. Not only is security taken very seriously, but obtaining nuclear weapons is not just like picking up a machine gun and starting to fire it. You need to have a lot of technical knowledge to really understand how to use and detonate nuclear weapons. And terrorist organizations usually don't have that kind of specialized knowledge. So even if they were actually to get physical access to a nuclear warhead, it's almost impossible that they would be able to launch it and detonate it. And that's how good the security is. So, like I said, we can talk more about this when we get to the Q&A. This is just my thoughts on sort of the nuclear war in South Asia. So let's look a little bit more at some of the India-Pakistan conflicts. They've had 3 major wars. 2 have been over Kashmir, 1971 Bangladeshi independence. And if you guys remember a few slides ago where I said Pakistani paranoia is not entirely rooted in reality, this is where the not entirely comes into play, because India has done it before. India helped Bangladesh achieve independence in 1971. When there was a civil war going on, India very much came in on the side of Bangladesh and helped it achieve independence. And, you know, this is only 50 years ago. And in South Asian memories, 50 years ago is like yesterday. And so the Pakistanis to them think, oh my gosh, you know, India once broke up our country. They took a big chunk of, you know, they took East Pakistan and they made it into a totally different country. They really went after the territorial integrity. They are going to do it again. And so this is where the paranoia comes in. It's very deep seated, that, you know, goes back to the trauma of breaking up the country in 1971. And then clashes that they've had that didn't erupt into full-scale war, but definitely were like everyone's heart was thumping and stopped, you know, wondering what was going to happen. Again, this is just a partial listing. This goes all the way down the page. If you were to list everything, it's everywhere from 1964, you know, different regions around on the border between India and Pakistan, on the line of control. You know, after the Indian attack on the Indian parliament, there was a huge mobilization. The Mumbai attacks, of course. Pakistan has supported Kashmiri insurgents from 1990 to now. And of course, just 2 years ago, Pulwama, Balakot. You know, the Pulwama, I guess for folks who are not familiar, Pulwama was Indian military base. And there was a suicide bomber that came across the border from Pakistan. And in response, India dropped a few bombs in this area called Balakot, which is in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. It resulted in a sort of aerial dogfight between the 2 countries, which was the first, you know, direct combat between India and Pakistan, you know, I think since the 1971 war. So, you know, lots of stress and concern, blood pressure is going up at this point, but things have cooled down a little bit since then. And so, you know, I normally, you know, when I give this talk, there's a lot of slides I put in the middle about what's happened since then and about the composite dialogue, but I figure those are details that we can talk about if you want to or not. But I did want to put in this one about latest moves, you know, what's happened. And India, since Pulwama Balakot, and basically since the re-election of Prime Minister Modi in 2019, has taken some provocative steps. They are not content to just sort of sit around, you know, but in August of 2019, they changed their constitution and which changed the status of Kashmir, made them 2 union territories, suspended their autonomy, you know, made all these things. And these changes directly contravened existing UN Security Council resolutions. That said, thou shall not change the status of Kashmir unless, you know, it comes back to Security Council for approval. But India just went ahead and did it. And of course, it sparked outrage in Pakistan. And Pakistan tried to bring this up to the UN Security Council, but nobody listened to them because international opinion is sort of moving away from Pakistan and moving towards India. And so, you know, this left Pakistan without many options about what to do. Same thing sort of happened when India passed a Citizenship Amendment Act, basically excluding Muslims from automatic citizenship. This triggered domestic protests, international condemnation, and really, you know, made Pakistan mad as well. However, as I mentioned, just in April, there were press reports of a bilateral discussion in Dubai. So this is how the Indians like to do things, is sort of away from the press, you know, hush, hush, you know, don't call that third-party mediation, you know, you can call it a go-between or whatever. And I do hope that India doesn't pull out of these now that they've been made public. And so I hope that they continue to go and sort of, you know, sort of back channel talks. So we'll see what happens and we'll keep a close eye on it. And all this leads to sort of some big questions between India and Pakistan. And this big question slide I often use because I also give lectures about South Asia to the Foreign Service Institute to train, foreign service officers are going out to the region. And so these are the big questions I ask them to think about. How does Pakistan respond to India's latest moves? Does it try diplomacy? Does it try more terrorist attacks? And can they speak for all Muslims in South Asia? As we talked about, how does India react to Pakistan's response? Diplomatic maneuvers by India are not likely to produce Pakistani concessions. So what does it do then? Modi has promised a strong response to terrorism, and he's shown it, being the first prime minister, in 50 years to respond kinetically to a terrorist attack. What does this mean for the future? And the question here, I unfortunately have to say no at this point. Is either side truly interested? I don't think so. I don't think so. I hope I'm wrong, and maybe the talks in Dubai will prove me wrong. And then this is a big question I always leave foreign service officers with. How in the world does the United States handle this situation? What do we do? Right? I don't have the answers. I'd love to hear your answers, and we can talk about it more in the Q&A. But this is a thorny issue. And like I said, it's more complex in Israel-Palestine, but gets way less attention, both sort of, in popular media and also from the US diplomatic corps. And so I think it's sort of very underappreciated how difficult it's going to be to resolve these issues. So that's India, Pakistan. Let's move on to who else in the region matters. And I see it's already 7:15, so I'll try and go a little bit quicker so that we don't run out of time at the end here. China is the biggest country that matters in this region. And, for China and India, it's the definition of a frenemy. You can see this picture here of Jawaharlal Nehru and Mao Zedong, back in the 50s, they were close. And you can see that the slogan that used to be said all over India before was Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. Indians and Chinese are brothers. They used to be very close. And one of the things I didn't put on this in this section on the slide because I couldn't find a good reference for it was that, but a story that I've heard a lot is that way back when the UN was formed in 1948 or 49, that India was offered a permanent seat on the UN Security Council because it turned it down because China did not also get offered one at the time. And that shows you how much solidarity there was between the two countries back then. I think this is, that story is true. I don't know for sure. But in the 50s and 70s, things turned sour. And, a lot of it was triggered by India giving refuge to the Dalai Lama. This still rankles China, 60 years later. They had this border war in 1962. China developed a strong partnership with Pakistan. They became all-weather friends. And finally, it resulted in China denouncing India as a tool of Soviet expansion. And so, their relationship really went down into the dumps. It's improved a little bit since then, but still they remain cool. And the tagline here, though, is, as the US gets bolder against China, so does India. And the Trump administration really took, a very bold stance against China. And this gave India sort of the leverage that it needed and the leeway that it needed to itself be bolder against China, because I think it felt like the United States had its back. And the Biden administration has kept up a strong policy against China. And I think that this is also providing India with leeway to be bolder against China. And honestly, I think it's driving the United States and India a little bit closer together. But the reason India fears China, if we look at this next slide, I'm sorry, one more slide about FRENEMY. This is just a quick map of all the disputed areas. You can see that they dot the border here between India and China. And then up here, this is where that border skirmish was last year in the spring of 2020, in a battle, between this region, which is Aksai Chin, and the rest of India-controlled Kashmir. And so, today they have testy relations marked by sporadic cooperation. And you can see there were a number of standoffs in the past few years, and tensions really went sky high in May and June of last year, like I said, over these issues. Troops pulled back from the border earlier this year, but tensions are still high. And you know, you can see this here, Belt and Road Initiative, that India denounced this back in 2019 and still continues to be very weary of it. And this next slide, I think, shows why they're weary of it. If you look at this, these dots here represent all the areas where China has major infrastructure projects. You know, in Yangon here, in Chittagong here in Bangladesh, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, in Malay, in the Maldives, Gwadar in Pakistan. They've got this China-Pakistan economic corridor going here. If you're India and you see this on a map, what are you thinking, right? Oh, crap, again, right? I'm being encircled by China. And so this has the Indians very, very concerned. You know, we've got to do something about this. And they haven't come up with a good response yet, but it's made them, I think, more open to cooperation with the United States because they view the United States as wholly taking their side if something happens with China. And so India very much fears encirclement, as you know, as I put at the top here, and you know, something to continue to watch. Okay, so that's enough about China. Let's talk about Afghanistan a little bit. And this is one of the few countries where India has had strong and friendly relations throughout, you know, sort of its history since 1947. They've had a close partnership for decades. You know, they were friendly neighbors before partition. And India has supported basically supported Afghanistan basically throughout its history. And there was only a short amount of time in the 1990s when India didn't support Afghanistan, and that was during the Civil War, and basically right afterwards when the Taliban came to power. They strongly opposed the rule of the Taliban, and so this was a dip in India-Afghanistan relations. But since 2001, when the Taliban was kicked out, strong and unyielding partnership. Besides the United States, they have been the largest donor of reconstruction and humanitarian assistance. You know, they signed they were one of the first countries to sign a partnership agreement. You know, they have a huge trade going with Afghanistan, but they must manage Afghan relations, and that's the but here. They have to manage Afghan relations in the context of Pakistan. And I put here, you know, through the Iranian port of Chabahar, and I think this map on the next slide really demonstrates what I mean here. And that's, if they want to send stuff to Afghanistan, they have to put it on a boat in Mumbai or Kandla here in Gujarat, ship it all the way to Chabahar, take it off a boat, put it on a train, take it by rail all the way up to Zahedan, and then, you know, on a truck to Zaranj, and at the border with Afghanistan, I got to put it on another truck and then circulate it around in Pakistan. And so this trip from India to Kabul takes weeks. And this is because Pakistan does not allow transit trade. And never, you know, for decades, they have never allowed Indian goods to trade through Afghanistan. And it's actually the United States that really bungled this up back in 2009, 2010, because they brokered a bilateral trade treaty between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and they purposely left out India. And so nobody understood. I didn't understand why they were doing it at the time. I was in the government and I couldn't figure out what was going on. But they purposely left out India. And they, of course, the Indians were like, well, if we can't have transit trade through Pakistan, then, you know, why should we support this? You know, this doesn't make any sense. And so this has also necessitated India keeping a sort of friendly relationship with Iran. You know, and when US diplomats go to India and say, hey, look, you've got to, you know, Iran is a big issue for us. You've got to cut ties and you've got to, you know, reduce your trade. The Indians pull out a map that looks something like this and say, what do you want us to do? You cut us out from a Pakistan-Afghanistan transit trade treaty. We have to get our goods into Afghanistan. In fact, the goods that support your troops and your reconstruction in Afghanistan come through Iran for us. What do you want us to do? And so this is, you know, a very, very complex situation. And I'd like to show this slide both, you know, to show that, you know, this really is sort of going around in a circle to get to Kabul, but also it's a good segue to talk about, you know, India and Iran. And they have had sort of a friendly relationship of convenience. It started off very warm back in the 1950s. and they had a treaty of friendship and perpetual peace. And they were on the opposite sides of the Cold War. And, of course, that never works out well for bilateral relationships. But then they tried to renew their partnership when the Cold War ended. And their interests actually converged, because India is very energy hungry and Iran has lots of energy. And so they built up this system of importing a lot of energy from Iran. And since, the early 2000s, the relationship has really fluctuated because the UN and the US have put a lot of pressure on India to reduce their reliance on Iran. Throughout the 2010s, India continued to import significant amounts of energy from Iran. But with sanctions ramping up, India was coming under pressure to completely cut ties with Iran. And India has always taken the attitude that, if there are international sanctions, that the UN passes, we will obey those. If there are bilateral sanctions imposed by the United States, we will not obey those. It needs to have the international imprimatur for us to be in compliance with them. And so they're trying to walk this fine line of being against Iran's nuclear program, but not cutting ties completely. And, this chart I put up here just to show, India's sort of how it's doing it, right? And you can see right here in 2020, Indian crude oil imports from Iran went to 0. And this was entirely because of international sanctions and pressure from the international community, including the United States. And India did not do this willingly because it has to then rely on other, countries. Maybe Iraq, obviously went up. Its reliance on the United States went up. And these other countries, I'm not sure what's in this category. But, this is something that they did not sort of want to do willingly. So India has tried to sort of walk a fine line with Iran. Now, if we switch gears a little bit and talk about Myanmar on the other side of India, and I wanted to talk, normally I don't talk about India and Myanmar, but since there was just a coup, I thought, it might be on people's minds. So it's good to sort of talk about it a little bit. Again, this is a country where India has had historically friendly relations. They in the 50s, they signed a treaty of friendship, and they've had a multifaceted, warm relationship just because they share so much, culturally and ethnically and religiously. And Myanmar is also very, very geostrategically important to India because it is the overlap between India's focus on its neighborhood and its focus on East Asia. It sort of falls in both camps. And so it wants to make sure that it has a good relationship with Myanmar. And also Northeast India, that little sort of chicken neck that goes around Bangladesh, has a long border with Myanmar. And sometimes extremists from Myanmar come across the border there, and it really affect the security of Northeast Asia. So it wants to keep a good relationship with Myanmar. But there's a stumbling block with China because China has immense influence in the country. And not just the military. China has immense influence over Aung San Suu Kyi's government too. They purposely built a very strong relationship with the NLD, the National League for Democracy in Myanmar, to the point where Aung San Suu Kyi supported in the UN China's actions against Hong Kong democracy protesters. And I always think to myself, God, how close must that relationship be for Aung San Suu Kyi to support the suppression of democratic protesters when she came to power herself on the backs of such protesters? So that tells you something about China's influence in Myanmar. And India is trying to push back on all that. But India tries to be cooperative. China is coercive, right? And so Myanmar prefers India, but sometimes they're just unable to resist China. And with regards to the coup that happened in February, India has maintained a very hands-off approach. India always wants to maintain influence and never wants to use its influence. And this used to drive me crazy when I talk to the Indians about all sorts of issues. They'd always say, oh, we can't tell, X country what to do. We have to maintain our influence there. And I used to say, well, what good is the influence if you never use it? But this is the same approach they have to Myanmar. They don't want to push Myanmar closer to China. And so they take a very hands-off approach. And it fits with India sort of historically not being involved in the internal affairs of other countries. This is sort of their way they've been since their founding or since independence. But most of all, India doesn't want to in any way contribute to be a failed state. It does not want Myanmar to go down that road. And so it's taken a very, hands-off approach. So that's Myanmar. Let's take a look at the smaller countries now. Those are the major countries that play, sort of a role in this region. If we look at the smaller countries, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Bhutan, they all have a codependent relationship with India. India is their, quote, big brother. And, kind of for these guys, all roads run through New Delhi. For all of them, India is the most significant foreign relationship, and it oftentimes guides or even directs their foreign policy. Bhutan has outsourced its foreign policy to India. They don't have a foreign policy of its own. They have a skeletal foreign ministry. They just say, you know what, India, you run our foreign policy for us. Whatever you say is fine, is fine. Nepal and Sri Lanka, a little bit different boat, but they defer to India quite a bit. And the funny thing is, India prefers to deal with each of them individually. They won't have bilateral relationships because they don't want these smaller countries ganging up on it, right? Or they don't want them talking to each other about, how they can influence India. They want to keep all of them under their heel. And Sri Lanka and Bangladesh have loomed large in Indian politics. Nepal and Bhutan, not so much. Nepal is gaining a little bit of influence now just because it sits between China and India. So people are talking about China trying to wrestle Nepal away from India a little bit in terms of influence. But Bhutan has not played a large role. And so that this sort of attitude of India preferring to deal with each of these countries individually really manifests itself in the South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation. And this is my last slide here, and then I'll shut up and let you guys ask questions. And this is a organization that John and I know very well because we were in the Regional Affairs Office of South Asia, of the South Asia Bureau. And, this South Asia Free Trade Agreement that I reference here, Free Trade Agreement that I reference here, was signed in 2004. And John and I actually played a very instrumental role in getting it agreed to and getting it signed. We made a lot of démarches to countries that were holding out and got this on the books. But John, as I'm sure you know, unfortunately, it hasn't really gone anywhere since 2004. Free trade has not really exploded as we had hoped back then. So, and one of the reasons is, again, India never lets SAARC become too influential. It prefers to deal with each of these countries bilaterally. It doesn't want a regional organization telling it what to do. And so you can see that this sort of, wanting to deal with each country individually really drives India's foreign policy and really drives its approach, and its security relationships as well really drive its approach. And so India is trying to manage this dangerous neighborhood that, I showed the map of at the beginning to its own advantage. And for a long time, it just tried to manage it on its own. Now we're starting to see it ask for, a little bit of help from other countries, including the United States. And it's starting to form more global relationships that are going to help it manage its neighborhood. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to John. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you didn't get bored. And I'm eager to, talk more about it with you guys and answer any questions anyone has. So thank you.
Thank you, Anish, for that sweeping overview. I regret that I didn't mention, I overlooked the fact that you came to the State Department as kind of rare background as someone with a Ph.D. in engineering from MIT, well, still in their 20s, and sort of made a pivot from engineering to diplomacy, and it worked out rather well for you, I'd say. Well, I think I'll use the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question, and also to everybody out there, just to remind you that you can use the text box and pose your questions, and we'll try to deal with them that way. But my first question is, as you pointed out, India has a keen interest in Afghanistan and in its stability. And of course, a very significant thing has happened this year within the last month or so. President Biden has announced the withdrawal of US troops, which will also entail the withdrawal of NATO troops. And that withdrawal is supposed to even be underway as we speak. So my first question is, what is India's reaction to this? And what measures, if any, have they taken in response?
So this raised a lot of, as far as I'm aware, this raised a lot of concern in New Delhi. India was one of the few countries that really strongly supported continued US involvement in Afghanistan because it viewed the United States and the coalition as a stabilizing force. And not only stabilized the country, but sort of kept the Taliban at bay and prevented, Pakistan from having influence. And so the withdrawal of troops is very concerning. Even if there was violence before, the Taliban was never in charge, right? They was never, sort of taking control of the government. And that's a real danger right now. And, as I mentioned on the slide, India, really did not support the Taliban when they were in power last time. And so they're very, very concerned. And what they're concerned most about, in addition to Taliban rule, is Pakistani influence, that the Taliban being in charge again will open the door for Pakistan to have immense influence in Afghanistan. In terms of steps that they've taken, I haven't really seen any sort of concrete steps that I'm aware of. But I think they're still mulling over their options, right? How much are they going to continue their humanitarian assistance? Are they going to, sort of up their security assistance? The United States always kept India from putting any boots on the ground in Afghanistan out of Pakistani sensitivities. Are those going to be reconsidered now? And so I think India has a lot of decisions to make, and it has to make them really fast.
Right. In fact, one of our first questions was precisely about Indian reaction to the possible resurgence of the Taliban. That here's another question. If the United States, quote, retreated from its political relationship with India, although that's unlikely, what do you think the results would be for India, for Pakistan, and the other fraught neighbors?
If the United States retreated from its relationship with India, what would be
let's say backed off from the rather warm approach that we've taken over the last decade or so?
Yeah, I think you would see India drifting closer towards Russia, because they're going to look for other security partners then. And, they probably will also, look for closer relationships with Japan and Australia like they have gotten in the Quad. But I don't think you can count out Russia. And they still have a close relationship with Russia. They import a lot of arms from, Russian suppliers. And they will look to whoever is going to have their back. If there is a conflagration with China, or if China attacks them in some way, they're going to look for someone who will come to their rescue. And so right now, I think it's an open question on if Russia would come to India's rescue, or at least come to India's side. But there's no question that they would provide a lot of arms. And so I think you would have a very destabilizing impact in South Asia. Everyone says, oh, the United States shouldn't meddle and all this stuff, but the United States actually provides a very, a stabilizing force in South Asia. And so if the US were to disengage, I think it would, increase the chances of India and Pakistan getting into a conflagration, increases the chances of India and China getting into a conflagration.
Well, one thing that you said in the answer to that question calls to mind, well, you specifically mentioned the Quad. And I wonder if you could just sort of lay out for the audience what exactly the Quad is and the sort of the development of the Quad. As you'll recall, when we were working together, it was sort of its first iteration, and we sort of tried to push the envelope a little bit and get the Quad to talk about security matters, and there was some shrinking back from that, particularly on India's part. But it seems to have really sort of taken off over the last couple of years, and I wonder if you could amplify.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do so. Yeah, sorry to slip into Washington speak there by referring it to as a Quad. I sometimes forget that I need to explain things a little more. But the Quad is a grouping of 4 countries: United States, India, Japan, and Australia. And as John mentioned, it started, about 15 years ago. But at that time, it was at a very low level, sort of assistant secretary level, and the 4 countries would just get together and talk about stuff. At first it was just a talk shop, like, compare notes, talk about their foreign policies. It was a way for India to let its partners know that, for the United States to let its partners know that this is, the policies it was taking on various issues in the region. And India, I'd say from the beginning, Japan and Australia were wholly all in, right? India was hesitant. And the reason India was hesitant is because it didn't want to be seen as a strong ally of the United States back then. And it didn't want to be seen as a strong partner either, really. And it also didn't want it to seem like it was involved in a grouping that was ganging up on China. At the time, it was still very, very sensitive, or very sensitive to Chinese sensitivities, and it didn't want to trigger any sort of response from China. And so, the idea of these 4 countries getting together and talking about China, really made the Indians uncomfortable. And so they shied away from it. It was at a very low level for a long time. And in the past couple of years, as John mentioned, it has intensified. And earlier this year, it had a ministerial at the foreign ministers level, and then it had a summit meeting at the presidential level. President Biden participated. It was on Zoom, of course, or video conference because of the pandemic, but it was still the first sort of summit level meeting of the Quad. And so you see that India is, taking a little bit more of a public, full embrace of the Quad. And I think this gets back to what I said on the China slide in my presentation, is that when the US becomes more bold against China, India does too. And so India feels like it has more leverage, it has more leeway. And also, China has been very active on India's borders over the past couple of years. There was this major standoff in Sikkim back in 2017. Sikkim is a little state that's just on the border between India and Pakistan, India and China. There was a major standoff in 2019. There was the border standoff, like I said, in Aksai Chin, where for the first time in decades, soldiers actually died in hand-to-hand combat. And so, this, I think, has gotten India a little concerned and realized that, if it's going to stand up to China, it needs to have its partners to do so. This is combined with the fact that Modi is taking a more aggressive approach against China. And so it's become more all in on the Quad. And it's evolved into much more than a talk shop now. They coordinate military activities. They do joint exercises. You saw India helping the United States do freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. And those things drive China crazy, but India is willing to do them now. So you can see that the Quad is a vehicle for India to sort of come out of its shell a little bit.
Okay, we have a question from Cy Chadley, longtime member of our North County chapter, which is, do you believe Xi Jinping and China are overreaching themselves with the Belt and Road Initiative, and will they be hit with non-paying debts?
I do believe that they're overreaching. And I think they've sort of gone out too fast, too far, and they're making a lot of enemies. If you look at their regional relationships, they're all sort of tanking right now. They got into a big fight with Australia. They got into a big fight with New Zealand. Other countries are sort of becoming aware. And in terms of non-paying debt, I think that's their whole game plan, because they want to turn that debt into ownership of infrastructure and political influence. And to me, that's the ultimate goal of Belt Road Initiative is, the infrastructure is nice and the economic cooperation is nice, but China wants political influence. And you can use as an example what happened in Sri Lanka. The Chinese built that port in Hambantota on the south coast of Sri Lanka. Sri Lankans couldn't pay the debt, and then Chinese took ownership of the port, and they run it. The same thing has happened a little further afield from South Asia, but the same thing has happened in Djibouti. They built a major seaport in Djibouti. The Djiboutians couldn't pay for it. Chinese took control of that port, and that is the same port through which all military equipment for the United States' war in Iraq and Syria comes through. And so now you have the Chinese sitting there, possibly able to turn off the spigot for things coming into Iraq for the US military. And so this stuff, that is the Chinese game plan. They want that political influence, and they want the ownership of the infrastructure. So non-paying debt for them, I think, is something that they'll say, we'll take it out of you some other way.
There's a question from Ann Burke. Excellent presentation, Anish. What is your overall impression of Prime Minister Modi, and what are your thoughts about his efforts to reshape India into a Hindu-first nation?
So I have very mixed feelings about Modi. I don't like his sort of authoritarian turn that he's taking. I don't like sort of the weakening of democratic norms. When I was in the State Department, when we were doing the nuclear deal, we could fend off any criticism of India by saying they're the largest democracy in the world. They have the strongest democracy in the world, right? Every time they hold an election is by definition the biggest exercise of democratic power in the world, in history. And that, spoke volumes to how much we trust the Indians and how strong their institutions were. And those institutions have weakened significantly. And to me, this is very alarming. And so I really don't like Modi for that. What I do like about Modi is that, he makes people feel good about being Indian in some cases, right? Like this sort of nationalist fervor, gets people patriotic, and that can be helpful at a time too. The second part of that question, sorry, was about India first or something, or?
Right, well, Hindu, the emphasis on the role of Hinduism in defining India's nationality.
Yes, and this is something that, again, to me is very alarming, that I don't like. India, historically has been a very secular country. I mean, it has had its religious, conflicts, and, it hasn't been perfect, but, this is a country that's sort of welcomed Muslims into it, welcomed the Muslims that live there since 1947. I mean, India had a Muslim president. I don't know many other countries that can say that they've had a minority like that up at the top of the government. And so to try and, turn it into a Hindu country, it to me is very alarming. And I say that I'm a Hindu myself, right? And I still don't like it. I don't like this Hindu nationalism. To me, it's very much like trying to turn the United States into, quote, a Christian country. It's not something that's in the fabric of India, and it goes against the Indian Constitution. And so I'm really against this Hindu nationalism.
That sort of segues, you mentioned India's Muslim population. We have a question from Bob Ning. Why does India not leverage its large Muslim population for favorable trade and political relations with its Muslim neighbors?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, Modi seems to be moving in the opposite direction.
Exactly. I think one of India's strengths throughout history has been its diversity. And its Muslim population has allowed it to build actually a good relationship with Muslim countries in the Middle East, and with Iraq and Iran. And so I don't, for Pakistan, I can, the issue is, the historical animosity, right, over Kashmir and everything that's involved in there. So that I can understand. And actually, I think India would love to trade with Pakistan more, right? And I think Indian businesses, I know, would love to trade with Pakistan more. And so, but in terms of leveraging their Muslim population, I think it, I just don't know how it would do that, because there's so little trust between India and Pakistan. I think the fact that there is such a large Muslim population in India rankles Pakistan rather than invoking trust. You know, I think Pakistan really resents that there's so many Muslims in India. It's not a point of trust for them.
You know, speaking of trade with Pakistan, when you discussed briefly the regional association SARC that we worked on, you didn't mention that one of the factors that has kept SARC a hollow shell in terms of being a free trade agreement is the fact that it was the Pakistanis who always resisted large-scale trading agreements with India because they were afraid that Indian manufacturers would swamp their domestic industries. Isn't that correct?
That is absolutely correct. That is absolutely correct. And what my response to that sort of argument always is, though, is that, like, it's already happening, right? It's just black market. You know, if you go to Lahore, or you go to Karachi, and you go to the markets there, it's all Indian stuff. You know, and Pakistan doesn't have any sort of film industry, so Bollywood films and Bollywood music is immensely popular in Pakistan. Indian textiles, right? Indian goods, right? Like it's already there everywhere in Pakistan. And by refusing to open up its borders to trade, it's just missing out on collecting all the taxes and the transit fees that could help help the country climb out of its debt, right? So closing the border is, not protecting its domestic industry. It's just draining the coffers of the Pakistani government.
Here's a question. It looks like it may be from Christine from the San Diego World Affairs Council. What are the reasons behind Bhutan relegating its foreign policy to India? And I'll add a little codicil to that. I've seen an article in foreignpolicy.com within the last week that China is building a whole village with infrastructure in a valley that's entirely within the borders of Bhutan, and nobody has noticed until quite recently.
So I think the reason Bhutan sort of outsources foreign policy to India is because I think it's for a couple of reasons. One, it's such a tiny country, right? It probably only has like 5 people to staff its foreign ministry. Like, I just don't think it has the capacity to run a sophisticated foreign policy. And so it's looking, for assistance in that regard anyways. And I think 2 is that it sees that, India is a benevolent power, whereas if it, threw its hat in with China, China is more of a malevolent, manipulative power. And so I think it feels like it will get a much better shake, and that its security interests are aligned with India, because it feels the the threat of the Chinese as well, right? Because it shares a border with China, and even though there's never been a skirmish between Bhutan and China up until 2019, there had never been a skirmish there. I think Bhutan continued to still feel the pressure. And when the skirmish happened in 2019, India came to their defense. And so for them, I think it's self-preservation, that if anything happens, we can count on India's, sort of security umbrella to envelop us. So,
okay.
In terms of Chinese, I didn't know about this village that they're building in Bhutan, but it does not surprise me at all. They're building stuff in U.S. territories that nobody knows about. So, they're spreading their money around as much as they can.
All right, we have a question from Ambassador Harnish. How does the Indian military class look upon the U.S. As an ally, as a friend? How exactly would you describe that relationship?
Yeah, I think friend is a good description. I'll admit that I have not met with a lot of officials from the Indian military, just because the civil military split in India is so strong, and civilian control of the military is so strong that when civilians like myself go to India, we're generally not allowed to meet with military officers. Military officers are only allowed to meet other like US military officers on like official exchanges and things like that. So I'll caveat my response by saying I'm not as familiar with the Indian military as I am with the Pakistani military. But my feeling is, from what I've heard from colleagues and, sort of observed, is that they do view us as a friend, but a fickle friend. And what I mean by that is, we're always threatening sanctions, right? Or sometimes we'll sell them something and then say, oops, never mind. And we'll take it back. And this has happened again and again throughout history. So they don't always trust that we're going to come through. And they don't always take us on our word. And this is happening again as we speak, because, back in 2018, the US Congress passed sanctions on countries that buy Russian missile defense equipment. And the Indians have bought an S-400 air missile defense from Russia. And so now the Biden administration has to decide if they're going to put sanctions on India because of this sale. And just the talk of sanctions, this gets back into sort of the Indian mindset that we're not a reliable supplier and we're not a reliable partner. And so, I think it's, we'd love to be stronger partners with you. You're great friends. We get along well with you, but we just can't rely on you. And so that seems to be the attitude that I've encountered.
Okay, a question from our past president, David Edick. What is your view on the entrance of the UAE into a brokerage role between India and Pakistan and Kashmir? Please characterize, and then the second part of his question is, can you characterize India's relations with the UAE and Qatar, especially after the death of Sultan Qaboos?
Sure. So on the first part of the question, I think it's great. Like I said during the talk, I think their Gulf countries in general, would be great mediators for the Indo-Pak issues, because they have great relationship with both countries. And UAE wasn't on my radar screen, honestly, but I welcome it. And, Dubai obviously has experience mediating in South Asia, right? Because they're running the Taliban, the intra-Afghan talks, and they ran the US Taliban talks, right? And so I think all that experience will help them be sort of very impartial, helpful mediators for these talks. Now, what I haven't been able to figure out from press reports is if Dubai is actually mediating or just hosting the talks. And either way, I think their involvement is good, because it takes attention away. I think it sort of reduces the tension sort of that might happen if someone like the United States, brought in all this attention and came and said, oh, we're going to mediate, right? So when I read about the UAE, I was very much in favor of it. In terms of India's relationship with the UAE and with Qatar, on Qatar, I'm going to have to say, I don't know. I never really studied that. It wasn't a big focus when I was in the Bureau. It wasn't a big focus when I was at the White House.
Anish, it was my screw up. It's Oman. Sultan Qaboos was Oman. Sorry.
Oh, okay. No problem. So my opinion is that, or my sort of take on India's relationship with the UAE and with Oman is that, it's strong, right? They get a lot of, both countries host a lot of migrant workers from India. And, they send a lot of remittances back home. And so for India, the UAE and Oman are both sort of big sources of revenue. And this is something that I think they really value for their own population. And they also, they value relationships with Muslim countries. And so I, as far as I'm aware, I think the relationship is strong. After the death of the Sultan, I don't know that it's changed a lot, but again, this is not something that I've studied quite a bit. So I'd love to hear someone else's opinion if they have any. So.
Well, we want to try to get through the remaining questions because they're good ones, and we have two on what might be the most important current question. one from Nathaniel Hillman and another from Phil Monroe, which is how is the current pandemic that's running rampant in India going to influence future Indian foreign policy considerations and Modi's leadership? And then Phil's question is, why hasn't the US sent massive COVID aid to India?
So the first question, I think COVID is going to have a huge impact on India's foreign policy and Modi's leadership. I think it weakens both of them because it really shows how India was unable to control or address sort of a situation that is killing millions of its citizens, right? So first, let's talk about his foreign policy. You know, the pandemic has kicked India backwards in its foreign policy evolution to a assistance recipient country. Because now it's accepting, you know, a donor, ventilators and oxygen cylinders and vaccines and materials for vaccines, all that stuff. It's accepting all this assistance from other countries, right? Even Pakistan offered to send assistance to India, and India was very embarrassed by it, right? India has worked hard over the last 20 years to turn itself into a donor or assistance donor country. And it has refused outside assistance for a number of its crises over the past 20 years. And so their foreign policy has become much more dependent on other countries now. And so this really is a big setback for India's foreign policy establishment. For Modi's leadership, you know, I think it's demonstrated how he, you know, the emperor has no clothes, right? That he was unable to mount a successful sort of response or intervention to the pandemic outburst. And also, it really showed how he was focused on the wrong things while the pandemic was happening, right? Because he was focused on getting Twitter to, you know, ban critical comments of him, right? And saying that, oh, no one should be criticizing the government and stuff like that. And this sort of gets back into his authoritarian streak, right? Trying to control what people are saying about him, you know, and my attitude is, dude, why are you focusing on this right now, right? Like, if you got to focus on saving your people, because that's how people are going to stop criticizing you. So that I think it's just it weakens everything. It weakens everything. Huge impact on the country. And in terms of why didn't the U.S. sort of immediately start sending massive amounts of aid? Great question. I thought they should have announced it much sooner and much more volume than what they have right now. But my guess is, you know, they wanted to make sure, the White House wanted to make sure that the United States was taken care of first. And they did not want to fall in the same trap as India did of being criticized for sending materials abroad while their own citizens were suffering. So I think that is the sort of the factor that went into it.
Okay, Petya, how much time have we got left? There's a couple more questions.
I think we have a couple more minutes to go through the last few questions.
Anish, I think you can deal with this next one fairly quickly, because in a way you pretty much addressed it in your remarks, which is, if the United States were to increase pressure with new sanctions on Iran, how will India respond? Clearly, India has an important vested interest in that relationship. If it were given an ultimatum, would India ever back completely away from Iran?
The answer is no and no. First of all, as I mentioned, India does not recognize U.S. bilateral sanctions. It will only recognize UN sanctions, international sanctions. And India, you know, it very zealously regards its sovereignty. So if any other country tells it what to do, you can almost be sure that they will never do it. And so if the United States gives India an ultimatum, I think India gives the United States the middle finger. So.
Okay, maybe one final question here. Doesn't the United States still provide assistance to India, both military and non-military? For example, USAID assistance?
Sure. So USAID has a very, very small mission in India now. I think it's less than $10 million, and it's focused entirely on like HIV/AIDS, you know, public health issues, maybe tuberculosis, however you pronounce that, and malaria. And so it shrank. You know, it used to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Then now it's sort of almost a skeletal humanitarian assistance program. In terms of security assistance, I think the United States makes India buy whatever it wants. It does not sort of provide foreign military financing for Indian programs. It probably does give us, you know, I don't know if depends on your definition of assistance, but Indian officers do come to US like naval war colleges and training facilities to get degrees and study and things like that. So they're a big participant in what's called the International Military Education and Training Program, which the United States pays for. So that's, you know, that is some assistance as well. But in terms of like big ticket items, I think India has to buy what it wants.
Yeah, and I would just add for people's information, when Anish and I were working together back in around 2004, 2005, we provided the first military assistance to India in the form of a excess defense articles ship, an amphibious vessel.
Oh yeah.
From that to within 8 or 10 years, over $8 billion worth of military sales to India. We became a major supplier, I think at one point even overtaking Russia in that category. And of course, we were looking out at the need for greater balance in Asia. And it was just as much in our interest as it was in India's, or so we still believe. But it was quite a remarkable evolution from really having nothing to do with India, which relied overwhelmingly on Russia, to now. So anyway, that we've run out of question time. I want to thank Anish for a terrific presentation, and to everybody for the great questions. I thought it was a good dialogue. And that's all for me. Over to Christine.
And Christine's turning it over to Petya, but a big thank you to Dr. Goel. We really appreciate it. We will have you back. And as you said, you can talk for 4 hours. So we'll have you back for another hour for sure. Thank you so much. And thank you.
This is really fun for me. So I really appreciate it. And I thank everyone for taking 2 hours out of their Thursday evening, you know, to listen to me. So it's been fun, and I really appreciate you guys inviting me to do this.
Thanks. We have a home here anytime. And Petya, it's over to you. Thank you.